Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do a bit more on the Actros. We've got the second parts bag which covers steps 6 to 11, so let's see how far we can get. Right, in the bag we've got the front axle, and just like the Tamiya part it feels like it's cast aluminium that's been painted black. And we've got the dampers and the leaf springs. Just like the last video, we'll pour the contents of the screws bags into some pudding pots for safekeeping. It makes the bits a bit easier to find, and most importantly it helps against losing bits off the table. Incidentally, we have the first of the bearings in this pot. Unlike Tamiya kits, I don't think we're going to find a single bushing anywhere in this build. When unpacking the leaf springs, they all come from the bag loose with two little aluminium bits. It took a while to figure out, but they should have been pressed through the centre of the holes in the leaf packs to keep them together. I'm guessing they got pushed through, but the ends never got flattened, so they just fell out. It's not a big problem, of course, it just makes the assembly a bit more fiddly. Here we go then, step 6, the steering bell crank. We'll need some plastic parts, and left to right we have C6, C16, C14 and C7 for the crank assembly, and we also need 6 plastic rod ends. For the steering bits we need 2 long rods. One's the steering drag link and the other one goes from the servo to the bell crank. 2 5mm ball ends, 2 M3 nuts and 2 M2x5s, the 2 bearings, the rod for the bell crank with its blind ends, and the M3x16 grub screw. Before we get building we need to tidy up one of the arms, C6. Around the base there's quite a lot of moulding flash that will get in the way. I suppose this is one of the disadvantages of the Hercules kit versus the Tamiya. You do have to keep an eye out. It only needs a quick trim with a knife though, so it's an easy fix. Next, in the inner of the 2 holes of one of the arms we need to fit a ball end and nut. The nut goes into the hex-shaped hole side and the ball end goes in through the other. It's a plain nut, so we're going to use a little bit of thread lock just to make sure it can't rattle loose. To avoid getting any on the plastic, we can fit the ball end and the nut, then put a little bit of thread lock on the exposed threads on the nut side. Then we undo the ball end a few turns to get the thread lock down into the nut and retighten. All being well, there will be just enough in the threads to work, but none of it should make it down into the plastic. While we're fiddling with the balls, we might as well fit the ball end to the other arm too. It's only got the one hole this time, so you really can't go wrong. Next we need to attach the C6 arm to the end of the spline shaft. The shaft has M2 threaded holes at each end, so before we fit the arm we need to apply a little bit of thread lock in the holes so we don't get any on the plastic. Just smear some around inside the threads with a cocktail stick and wipe off any excess around the ends. Now the arm just slides on and one of the M2x5 screws goes in the end. It's all quite a good fit too. It's not super tight, yet there's no slop detectable. Next on the shaft is the large bearing, followed by the long C16 spacer. The mounting block C14 goes over the top, and the small bearing slides over and presses down into the block. Lastly, the other arm C7 sits on top at 90 degrees to the other one. But when the arms are fully pressed home, there's quite a bit of vertical slop in there that really won't help straight line performance. Off camera I did a quick compare with a Tamiya version from a high lift, and it really is just as bad. So as we're coming to expect, Hercules have faithfully copied Tamiya. To help, I'm going to fit a 0.5mm shim under the arm. It'll take out most of the play, making it run just that bit better. With the top arm in place, all we need to do is fit the second M2x5 in the top. Push rods next, and we'll have a quick look as they're not exactly complicated. There's 2 types of rod. The first one is just a long grub screw. All we do is screw it into one of the rod ends using an Allen key. We want to have it a bit less than halfway in. It's really not that critical though. When one end's done, we just screw on the other. For the longer rod, we just grab the plain part of the rod with some pliers. But wait, if the rod skids in the jaws, it's going to damage the plating and it will rust up in no time. So we need to use some cardboard in the jaws just to add a bit of protection. The boxes the servo came in are a handy source. Usually with the Tamiya kits, those diagrams of the rods are actual size, so you can just hold the completed rod up and check the length. But as you can see with these diagrams, they're a bit off. I'm not going to say that they've scanned in the Tamiya manual and didn't scale it properly, but they probably did. Anyway, you can use a ruler, or if you have a vernier, set it to the right length, 91mm for the long one, and set the rod ends to match. It's a bit more of a faff than it really should be, but it's not so bad. Right, step 7, the steering servo. This one's quite simple, as we've already done all the hard work. To fit the bits, we need 4 M3x12s and 3 M3x8s. First we'll fit the bell crank assembly. It fits on the side of the chassis just behind the damper mount, with the arm with the 2 holes at the top. To attach it to the chassis, we just install the 4 M3x12s. They just go through the mount into the threaded holes in the chassis. A bit further back on the chassis we can fit the steering servo. Oddly, it uses 3 screws because the mounting plate has a notch in it to clear the side panel stay. We just need to install the screws. It would probably be a good idea to use a little bit of thread lock too. The last part of this step is to install the middle-sized linkage between the servo arm and the bell crank. All you need to do is line them up and give the rod ends a bit of a squeeze with some pliers. Now it looks like it's going to work well enough, but there is however absolutely zero slop, which usually would be a good thing, but in this case it's because the rod ends are very stiff on the balls. We'll have to see how the other ones are, but we might end up needing to change them before running the truck. Step 8, the front axle. Now the axle itself is a single casting, so that's ready to go. What we need to do though is sort out the leaf springs. As mentioned earlier, the leaves should be pinned together with these little aluminium rivets. If we stack one up, we can pop the rivet through the middle hole. To keep it in place, we might be able to give it a squeeze in a vise, but it's really not worth the trouble. Also a bit of a problem, you can see the 2 shorter leaves are almost completely flat. They're really not going to do much in terms of actually being springs. We could have a go at putting some more curve on them, but they're spring steel, so that would be a bit tricky for a start, and they have holes in the middle, so it would be all too easy to put a sharp bend right where the hole is. I think for now we're just going to build as is. The worst thing that's going to happen is the truck's going to ride a bit low, but maybe having that lowered look might suit it. And of course, worst comes to the worst, I think I've got some Tamiya leaf springs somewhere that would be a straight swap. Other than the leaf springs and the axle, we also need the 2 lower damper mounts, 4 U-bolts, and the 2 plates that act as the spring seats. For attaching things, we're going to need 2 M3x6s and 8 M3 nylon nuts. Now, because the spring packs aren't riveted together, the hardest part of this stage is going to be stopping them from falling apart while we get the U-bolts on. We need to very carefully hold the first pack together with the U-bolts held up in position with a finger. Pop the axle on top, followed by 1 of the plates and 2 of the nuts. We only want to do the nuts up finger tight for now, just so it doesn't immediately fall apart. Now we can feed the second U-bolt up and around the spring and up through the plate so we can install 2 more nuts. Tighten up the nuts until the U-bolts are just starting to get a good grip on the springs. We want them so we can still just about move the spring so we can centre them up. Now normally the rivets would sit in recesses on the axle to locate them, but without the rivets we're going to have to jiggle them around until all the centre holes line up. Thankfully, you can clearly see them, so we don't have to measure anything to get them spot on. I found the nuts bottom out on the U-bolts when the tension is about right, so as long as you don't use too much brute force, you can tighten each nut at a time just until they stop. Having said that, we might end up needing to loosen them a bit to get them to sit nicely in the shackles when we fit the axle to the chassis, but we'll deal with that when we get to it. You never know, they might just drop straight in. As you might imagine, the second leaf pack is exactly the same, so we will just cut to that one being fitted. Saves a bit of time. Next we've got the damper mounts, but before we fit them we're going to smear a bit of thread lock in the holes. The holes are on the flat face directly above the leaf springs, if you have the axle upside down. We just need a bit of thread lock on a cocktail stick just to get it in the hole. Now we can install the damper mounts. They should straddle the leaf springs, so they're going to help square up the leaf packs. Now this hasn't been the best bit of the build so far, a bit more faff than it really should have been. We're going to leave it as it is though, and see how it does when the truck's finished and the springs are loaded up. You never know, they might just be fine. Step 9 next, we've got the dampers that don't actually damp. Right, we're going to need the 4 bodies, 4 caps, 4 clear O-rings, 4 shafts, and 4 springs. Now usually you don't really need the coil springs as the leaf springs are more than stiff enough on their own, so we'll just leave them out. However, we might end up fitting them later due to the malformed leaf springs that might not hold up the truck. And of course for plastic bits we're going to need 4C3s. These look a lot like ball type rod ends, but the holes are actually parallel to run on a post rather than clip on a ball. The caps are already fitted to the body, so the first thing to do is unscrew them. The threads are nicely formed, so they come off without any fuss. Next we pop an O-ring over the shaft and stuff it in. Now it will be difficult to get it past the threads, and it will probably damage the outside of the O-ring. But these aren't oil dampers, so they don't need to have a good seal. The job of the O-ring is to have something to slide up and down inside that isn't going to wear like metal. With the shaft inside the body, we can install the rod end. It's easier than most dampers because the end of the shaft has a hole for an Allen key, so there's no trying to grab the shaft with pliers. Although with this, you might actually want to grab the rod end with something. Next the cap goes on. Now it doesn't need to be incredibly tight, just bottomed out plus an extra little tweak. Now that should be it, but pushing the shaft up and down I found it felt a bit grabby. It feels like the end of the shaft is struggling to cleanly run up and down inside the body. It's an easy fix though, we just pop the cap off and put a spot of fairly thick oil in. It doesn't really matter exactly what it is, just don't put much in. We want it to coat things, but not drain out through the bottom making a mess. Or you might get away with a fairly light grease. But if it's too thick though, the damper will probably squirt it out past the O-ring on the bumps. It needs to freely pass the flat on the end of the shaft. Anyway, repeat 3 more times and you've got a complete set of non-damping dampers. Step 10 next, hanging the axle and fitting the dampers. For fixings we need 6 M3x14 step screws, 2 damper collars, 2 M3 flange nuts, 2 M3x12s and 6 M3 nylocks. From the assemblies we've already put together, we need a pair of dampers, the front axle and of course the chassis. The axle goes in with the damper mounts towards the front, and with any luck the ends of the leaf springs will nicely drop in between the shackles. If they don't, you would just need to loosen the 8 nuts on the U-bolts, let everything settle and retighten. Starting with the fixed mounts at the front, we need to pop in a step screw from the outside. Pop both screws in first, as it makes everything a lot more stable so it's easier to manage. To stop the screws coming out, they just need a nylock fitting on the inside. For now we'll just do them up finger tight until all the rest are in too. The shackles get the same treatment. We want the shoulder screws from the outside and the nylocks on the inside. Next we'll fit the dampers. They use the long M3 screws and the damper collars with the flange towards the damper mount. They're a little bit fiddly to get in without dropping the collar, so try not to lose one in the carpet. On the back to hold them in we use a flange nut. Now these have teeth on the flange, so they shouldn't really need any thread lock. And besides, we might need to retrofit those coil springs if the leaves are too soft, so keeping them easy to remove might be a good idea. At the bottom, the plastic ends slot into the metal mounts on the axle, and we use another step screw from the outside and a nylock from the inside to keep it in. When you're happy with how everything fits, the leaves are aligned and they all move nicely, go around and tighten up all the screws and nuts. You should be able to bottom them out on all the shoulder screws and still have enough clearance for smooth operation. If something's sticky, pop the screw out and find out why. Step 11. Fitting all the steering bits. We'll need the hubs E8 and E9, the 2 upright shafts, 2 link pins, though I think I'd tend to call them king pins, 3 5mm ball ends, 2 E-clips and 2 M3 plain nuts. On the long ends of the hubs there's a hex-shaped hole for a nut. On the other side we need to screw in one of the ball ends. Now it might be a good idea to use a little bit of thread lock, but there's really not much plastic around the nuts, so if it gets contaminated they will break very easily. If there's enough thread on the screws, we might get away with replacing the plain nuts with nylocks. On E9, the hub on the right of the diagram, we also need a ball end fitting to the short arm. Again, there's a hex-shaped hole for the nut, so it's really easy to do. I found one of the holes in the hubs for the kingpin had some moulding flash in. Pressing the kingpin in partially dislodged it, and running the knife around the inside cut it free. It's very important to make sure all the parts are nice and clean. Now I must admit it's not something I've ever really seen with Tamiya kits. They're always near enough perfectly moulded. In the side of the hub we need to fit one of the upright shafts. On the large end there's a hole that should line up with the holes in the hub. They're going to be running on metal kingpins, so they're going to want a bit of grease. I'm going to use some of the grease that came with the 3 Racing X reel. Now, I'm pretty sure it's a lithium grease, but any fairly light grease will do here. It's just to coat the surface so they move freely without catching. Next, the hub assemblies slide into the end of the axle with the long arm towards the front. Now unfortunately that is indeed backwards. When Tamiya designed the Euro trucks they obviously couldn't get it all to fit, so they flipped the hubs. It works, but the Ackerman angle ends up in reverse, so the outside wheel is going to steer more than the inside. Anyway, all we do to fit the hub is slide the kingpin in through the bottom and clip on an E-clip. If all goes well, the hub should smoothly turn on the kingpin without binding. Repeat on the other side and we can move on. Interestingly, these hubs seem to have a lot less slop in them than the Tamiya ones, but I think that might be luck rather than design. Just a couple of bits left to do. We need to clip the short linkage between the lower bell crank arm and the short arm of the nearest hub. Access is a bit tricky, so you need to be careful not to stress the hubs too much. It really wouldn't be difficult to snap one of the arms off. Same goes for the long link that ties the hubs together. Right, time for a test. If we hook up the servo tester again, we can see how it all works. It's worth noting all the ball ends were very stiff. So stiff the servo struggles a bit to centre, which really isn't good. Off camera, after I'd filmed this, I popped one of the rod ends off and tried a proper Tamiya equivalent, which worked a lot better. It's almost like the Hercules parts are just slightly undersized. You can get a pack of 6 Tamiya ends for a few quid, so it's going to be worth getting a set. The Tamiya part number is 50596. Well, that's a good place to stop for this week then. We're done with the 6 to 11 parts bag, and next time we start on a separate assembly, the rear axle. So as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and please leave a message after the tone. Bye guys!